The cold clang of the janitor's broom against the marble floor stopped abruptly. A hush fell over the vast lobby of the Sterling Tower, not the kind of silence that fills a room with peace, but the suffocating silence of a secret too heavy to bear. They never imagined the eyes that swept these halls saw everything, and that here, amidst the glittering arrogance, two men bore a secret meant to change everything. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking the cameras, or locking the building doors for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. At the heart of New York City's pulsating Midtown, Sterling Tower rose like a steel monument to ambition, its 67 floors piercing the autumn sky with cold determination. The lobby sparkled under crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across imported Italian marble, each vein in the stone worth more than most people earned in a year. This wasn't just an office building. It was a cathedral of capitalism where millionaires strode through with heads held high, their tailored suits worth more than luxury cars, their briefcases containing contracts that moved millions through the stock market with a single signature. And there, among these statues of wealth and superficial grandeur, moved William Harris, the night janitor whose existence seemed as invisible as the dust particles floating in the golden light. His faded blue jumpsuit, worn soft by countless washes, blended into the gray shadows between the pillars. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he understood that every sweep of his broom was part of a larger ritual he'd performed for over 2 decades. But William's eyes, sharp gray eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless fortunes, watched more keenly than any security camera. They held the quiet wisdom of a man who had learned that true power often wore work boots instead of Italian leather, that dignity couldn't be purchased with cryptocurrency or inherited through trust funds. His weathered hands, scarred by years of honest labor, gripped the broom handle with the same reverence others reserved for gold bars or stock certificates. The Sterling Tower hummed with the quiet energy of accumulated wealth. Each night, William moved through its corridors like a ghost, absorbing conversations about Bitcoin investments and offshore accounts, overhearing whispered deals worth more money than he'd see in several lifetimes. The air itself seemed thick with the scent of expensive cologne, mixing with the metallic taste of ambition, while the soft hum of climate control systems maintained perfect conditions for both million-dollar art pieces and the egos they reflected. William had arrived at Sterling Tower 23 years ago, when the building was newer, and the dreams within its walls still carried traces of innocence. He'd watched young executives become cold CEOs, witnessed family fortunes built on questionable investments, observed how easy it became for people to forget their humanity when their net worth reached 7 figures. Yet through it all, William maintained his quiet dignity, his internal compass pointing toward truth even when surrounded by the magnetic pull of corruption. His small apartment in Queens, a 40-minute subway ride from Manhattan's glittering heart, contained no luxury beyond clean sheets and a coffee pot that still worked after 15 years. The walls displayed no certificates or awards, only a faded photograph of his late wife, Margaret, whose smile reminded him daily that wealth measured in love far exceeded any financial portfolio. Her memory kept him grounded, whispering reminders that honor couldn't be traded like stocks, that a man's worth wasn't determined by his bank account, but by how he treated others when nobody was watching. Every evening at 6:30, William would arrive at Sterling Tower carrying a worn leather satchel that contained his dinner, usually a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and an apple, and a small notebook where he recorded maintenance needs with the precision of an accountant logging dividends. His routine never varied: unlock the janitor's closet, change into his uniform, and begin the methodical process of restoring order to a building where chaos masqueraded as success. Life for William was a carefully choreographed dance of invisibility and purpose. He emptied overflowing trash bins filled with discarded documents worth millions, each crumpled paper representing someone's fortune, gained or lost. He buffed floors polished to mirror-like perfection, reflecting the faces of people who looked through him as if he were transparent. The contrast was stark and intentional, his gray world existing in the shadows of their golden spotlight. The building's inhabitants moved around William like water around a stone, their conversations flowing uninterrupted by his presence. Investment bankers discussed cryptocurrency portfolios while stepping over his mop bucket. Real estate moguls debated property acquisitions in elevators he was cleaning, their words carrying the weight of millions in capital they controlled with casual indifference. To them, William was part of the infrastructure, as unremarkable as the heating system or the security cameras, necessary but unworthy of acknowledgement. Yet beneath their tailored exteriors and confident handshakes, William observed the cracks in their facades. He noticed which executives stayed late not from dedication, but from fear of going home to empty apartments purchased with inherited money. He saw how certain board members' hands shook slightly when discussing quarterly reports, revealing anxiety that no amount of wealth could cure. Their conversations, overheard during late-night cleaning sessions, painted pictures of people trapped by their own success, prisoners in golden cages they'd built with stock options and investment returns. The cruelest moments came disguised as casual indifference. Employees would drop trash beside waste bins William had just emptied, forcing him to clean up after their thoughtless behavior. Others would track mud across freshly mopped floors without breaking stride in their conversations about profit margins and asset allocation. Some whispered jokes about the help while he worked nearby, their laughter sharp as broken glass against his dignity. Among the building's inhabitants, none embodied this casual cruelty more than Clark Sterling himself, the millionaire owner whose name adorned the building like a golden crown. Clark moved through his empire with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether his wealth was earned or simply accumulated through fortunate timing and family connections. His handshakes were calculated, his smiles reserved for those whose net worth justified his attention, his gaze sliding past William as if looking through empty air. Clark's fortune, built through a combination of real estate investments and strategic stock market moves, had insulated him from the normal consequences of human behavior. When market downturns affected others, his diversified portfolio absorbed the shock. When business deals went wrong for competitors, Clark's lawyers and accountants ensured his assets remained protected. This financial immunity had gradually eroded his empathy, replacing human connection with transactional relationships measured in dollars and cents. The Sterling family's wealth traced back 3 generations, beginning with Clark's grandfather, who'd built a modest construction company into a real estate empire. Each generation had multiplied the family fortune, first through traditional investments, then through aggressive expansion into commercial properties, and finally through Clark's ventures into cryptocurrency and international markets. By the time Clark inherited control, the family's net worth exceeded anything his grandfather could have imagined, spread across properties, stocks, bonds, and digital assets that generated passive income while he slept. But wealth, William had observed, often created its own form of poverty. Clark's relationships existed primarily on spreadsheets, business partners whose value was measured in potential profit, family members whose trust fund distributions determined their proximity to his affection, employees whose salaries represented line items rather than human lives. The deeper Clark dove into his financial empire, the further he drifted from the simple human connections that had once anchored his grandfather's success. William's greatest challenge wasn't the physical demands of his job or even the daily indignities he endured. It was maintaining his inner dignity while surrounded by people who had convinced themselves that wealth equaled worth, that financial success justified moral compromise. Each night, as he cleaned offices where million-dollar deals were structured to exploit workers like himself, William struggled against bitterness that threatened to corrode his soul like acid eating through metal. Yet he persevered, finding strength in small victories and quiet moments of purpose. When he discovered important documents accidentally thrown away, He'd placed them carefully on the appropriate desk, never seeking recognition for preventing potential disasters. When security systems malfunctioned, his decades of building knowledge allowed him to implement temporary fixes that kept the tower functioning smoothly. His presence was the invisible glue holding together a structure that would collapse without his constant, unacknowledged care. The weight of his invisibility pressed down on William's shoulders like a physical burden, each day adding another layer to the armor of silence he'd constructed around his heart. He'd learned to find dignity in solitude, strength in being underestimated, power in observing truth while others performed elaborate deceptions. His wife, Margaret, had taught him that real wealth couldn't be measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It lived in the quiet satisfaction of work done honestly, relationships built on trust and love that didn't require financial backing. But deep within the Sterling Tower's foundation, hidden in a maintenance closet that even the building's architectural plans had forgotten, lay a secret that would eventually tip the scales of justice. A small, unremarkable metal box, its surface scratched by age and handling, contained evidence that William had been protecting for years, not from malice or hope of profit, but from a simple understanding that truth, like fine wine, sometimes needed time to reach its full potency. The box had come into William's possession through circumstances that seemed almost accidental, but felt divinely orchestrated. 5 years earlier, while replacing antiquated electrical panels in the building's basement, he discovered the container hidden behind a false wall, its contents revealing a side of Sterling Tower's operations that would shock even its most cynical inhabitants. Inside were recordings, documents, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching the highest levels of the building's management. Rather than rushing to expose what he'd found, William had chosen patience, the same quality that had sustained him through decades of invisible labor. He understood intuitively that premature revelation would be easily dismissed or covered up by people with unlimited legal resources and political connections. Instead, he'd waited, continuing his quiet observations while the evidence in the box grew more damning with each passing year. The autumn evening when everything changed began like any other, with William arriving at Sterling Tower as the last of the day shift employees streamed toward the subway. Their conversations focused on weekend plans funded by salaries that dwarfed his annual income. The building's lobby stretched before him in familiar silence, its marble surfaces reflecting the fading sunlight that painted the windows gold. But tonight, something felt different, a tension in the air that reminded him of summer storms gathering strength beyond the horizon. As he began his evening routine, William noticed unusual activity on the upper floors. Security guards appeared more alert than usual, their radios crackling with coded communications that spoke of heightened vigilance. Executive assistants worked later than normal, their office lights creating a constellation of anxiety against the darkening sky. Even Clark Sterling remained in his penthouse office well past his usual departure time, his silhouette visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows as he paced like a caged predator. The source of this disturbance revealed itself just after midnight, when William was cleaning the 15th floor and overheard a heated phone conversation from Clark's office. The penthouse elevator had malfunctioned earlier, forcing Clark to temporarily relocate to a lower floor, a stroke of mechanical fate that placed him within earshot of someone who understood the value of listening carefully. Clark's voice, usually smooth with practiced confidence, carried notes of panic that William had never heard before. The conversation involved missing artifacts from a private collection, insurance claims worth millions, and urgent meetings with lawyers who specialized in criminal defense. The words federal investigation and asset forfeiture punctuated Clark's increasingly desperate monologue, painting a picture of an empire under siege from forces beyond his control. But the conversation's most revealing moment came when Clark mentioned specific dates and times that William recognized from his own careful observations. Events that had seemed unconnected began forming a pattern in his mind. Late-night meetings with unscheduled visitors, unusual security measures around certain exhibitions, mysterious shipments that arrived without proper documentation. The pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly clicked into place, revealing a picture of systematic fraud that had been hiding in plain sight. As William continued his cleaning duties, his mind raced through implications that stretched far beyond Sterling Tower's walls. The evidence hidden in his metal box wasn't just historically significant, it was legally explosive, capable of bringing down not just Clark Sterling, but an entire network of corruption that reached into New York's highest social circles. Financial crimes involving cryptocurrency manipulation, art fraud, and money laundering through offshore accounts had been operating under his nose for years, disguised as legitimate business operations. The weight of this knowledge settled on William's shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy with the responsibility of countless lives that would be affected by whatever actions he chose to take. Employees who depended on Sterling Tower for their livelihoods, investors whose retirement funds were tied to the company's stock performance, and even the building's tenants who had unknowingly become part of an elaborate criminal enterprise. Yet, alongside this burden came a familiar strength, the same quiet determination that had sustained him through 2 decades of invisible service. William understood that his moment of choice was approaching, that the patience he'd cultivated like a careful gardener was about to bloom into action. The secret he'd protected was ready to emerge from shadow into light, carrying with it the power to restore balance to a world tilted toward injustice. That night, as he locked the janitor's closet and prepared to head home to Queens, William paused in the lobby and looked up at the Sterling Tower's towering height. Somewhere in those gleaming floors, powerful people were making decisions based on the assumption that their wealth made them untouchable, that their money could buy immunity from consequences that ordinary people faced every day. They had built their empire on a foundation of ignored voices and invisible labor, never imagining that the man who swept their floors might hold the key to their downfall. The cool October air that greeted William as he stepped onto the sidewalk carried hints of the coming winter, but also whispers of change that seemed to echo from the building behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh opportunities to choose between silence and truth, between the safety of invisibility and the risk of standing in the light. But tonight, as he descended into the subway system that would carry him home to his modest apartment and his wife's photograph, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet anticipation of justice finally finding its voice. The next several weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy, like the calm before a hurricane when even the air seems to hold its breath. William continued his nightly routines with the same methodical precision, but now every conversation he overheard, every document he glimpsed, every nervous glance between executives added another piece to the growing picture of corruption he was assembling in his mind. The metal box in the maintenance closet seemed to pulse with energy, as if the truth it contained was straining against its physical constraints. Clark Sterling's behavior became increasingly erratic, his usual commanding presence replaced by something that resembled barely controlled panic. Phone calls that once discussed stock options and dividend payments now focused on legal strategies and damage control. The building's atmosphere grew thick with tension as rumors began circulating among employees about federal investigators asking questions, subpoenas being served, and asset freezes that threatened to paralyze operations. But it was on a rainy Thursday evening in November that the storm finally broke, beginning with an accusation that would change everything and ending with William's world turned upside down by forces he had never seen coming. The drama unfolded in the building's main conference room, where a gathering of Sterling Tower's most important tenants and investors had been hastily arranged to address what Clark described as a serious security breach affecting all of our interests. William was cleaning the adjacent hallway when the meeting began, his presence so expected and ignored that no one thought to lower their voices or close the doors. Through the glass walls that separated the conference room from the corridor, he could see Clark pacing at the head of a long table, surrounded by some of New York's most powerful figures, real estate magnates whose portfolios included half of Manhattan, investment bankers who moved billions through international markets, and cryptocurrency entrepreneurs whose digital fortunes had been built on the promise of financial revolution. The centerpiece of their anxiety was a collection of rare artifacts that had been on display in Sterling Tower's private gallery. Priceless items loaned by museums and private collectors for an exclusive exhibition that demonstrated the building's cultural sophistication. But three of the most valuable pieces, including a 19th-century diamond necklace worth over $2 million, had vanished without a trace. Security footage showed no evidence of external intrusion, employee background checks had revealed nothing suspicious, and the building's state-of-the-art alarm systems had recorded no unusual activity. Clark's voice, when he finally addressed the assembled group, carried the weight of desperation masked as authority. He spoke of the thoroughness of their internal investigation, the cooperation they were providing to law enforcement, and their commitment to recovering the missing items regardless of cost. But his words rang hollow against the backdrop of nervous glances and whispered conversations that revealed how much money was at stake: insurance claims, legal liabilities, and reputation damage that could topple entire business empires. Then came the moment that shattered William's world like a hammer striking glass. Clark's gaze, scanning the room for someone to blame, finally settled on the barely visible figure in the hallway. With a voice that carried across the conference room like a death sentence, he spoke words that would echo in William's mind for months to come. The only person with unlimited access to every floor, every room, every secure area in this building is our night janitor, William Harris. He's been here for 23 years, knows every inch of this place, and frankly, his financial situation would provide more than enough motivation for this kind of theft. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of William's cleaning cart wheels squeaking as his hands trembled with shock. Through the glass wall, he could see faces turning toward him, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, a few with the cold calculation of predators sensing wounded prey. These were people accustomed to finding scapegoats for their problems, to deflecting blame onto those who couldn't defend themselves with high-priced attorneys and political connections. What hurt most wasn't the accusation itself, but the ease with which it was accepted. No one questioned Clark's logic or demanded evidence beyond William's poverty and proximity. No one mentioned his decades of flawless service, his reputation for honesty that had never been questioned, or the fundamental absurdity of a man who lived in a studio apartment attempting to fence artifacts worth millions on the international black market. Their minds had already moved past guilt or innocence to the practical matter of containing damage to their own interests. Within an hour, William found himself sitting in Sterling Tower's security office, facing a panel of investigators, insurance adjusters, and lawyers whose combined hourly fees exceeded his annual salary. They fired questions at him with the mechanical precision of people who had reduced human tragedy to billable hours and profit margins. Where had he been on the night in question? Who else had access to his keys? What did he know about the building's security systems? Each question carried the implicit assumption of guilt. Each answer twisted to fit their predetermined narrative. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in how wealth could reshape reality to suit its purposes. Security footage was analyzed frame by frame, but somehow the cameras had experienced mysterious malfunctions during the crucial hours when the theft occurred. Employee polygraph tests were administered to everyone except the building's management team, whose legal representatives successfully argued that their elevated stress levels would compromise test accuracy. Financial records were scrutinized with surgical precision, revealing every modest purchase William had made over the past 5 years while ignoring the complex web of offshore accounts and cryptocurrency transactions that funded the lifestyles of his accusers. The media coverage that inevitably followed painted William exactly as Clark intended, a desperate man driven to crime by poverty and resentment. Tabloid headlines screamed about the millionaire's janitor who had exploited trust for criminal gain, while television news segments featured security experts explaining how inside knowledge could compromise even the most sophisticated protection systems. No one interviewed William's neighbors in Queens who would have testified to his character. No one spoke with Margaret's former colleagues at the community center who remembered his devotion to his late wife and his reputation for absolute honesty. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the legal proceedings. Every day brought fresh humiliation as co-workers who had barely acknowledged his existence for decades suddenly became amateur detectives, analyzing his behavior for signs of guilt. Elevator conversations stopped when he entered, resumed in whispers after he left. Employees who had once treated him with casual indifference now regarded him with open suspicion, their discomfort with his presence palpable as morning fog rolling off the Hudson River. Clark Sterling, meanwhile, had transformed from William's employer into his primary tormentor, wielding the accusation like a weapon designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. He made a point of being present whenever security personnel questioned William, his expensive suit and confident smirk serving as constant reminders of the power imbalance that made justice seem impossible. During these encounters, Clark's behavior revealed a side of his personality that wealth had normally kept hidden, a cruel enjoyment of others' suffering that transformed the search for truth into a kind of blood sport. The investigation dragged on for 3 months, each day bringing fresh indignities that slowly eroded William's ability to maintain his usual quiet dignity. His modest savings disappeared into legal fees for an overworked public defender who seemed more interested in plea bargaining than establishing innocence. His reputation in the Queens neighborhood where he'd lived for 2 decades became a source of gossip and speculation that transformed friendly neighbors into suspicious strangers. Even his daily subway commute became an ordeal as he imagined recognition in every glance, whispered judgment in every conversation. But perhaps the cruelest cut came from the realization that his decades of invisible service had meant nothing to the people he'd protected and served. All those late nights when he'd stayed past his shift to ensure the building remained secure, all the small problems he'd solved before they became crises, all the careful attention to detail that had kept Sterling Tower running smoothly, none of it counted in the scales of justice when weighed against the convenience of a poor scapegoat. The end, when it came, arrived with the same sudden brutality that had characterized the entire ordeal. On a cold February morning, William was summoned to Clark Sterling's office and informed that his employment was being terminated immediately. No formal charges had been filed, the evidence was too circumstantial for prosecution, but the shadow of suspicion made his continued employment inappropriate for all concerned parties. The words were delivered with the commercial coldness of a business transaction, as if 23 years of loyal service could be erased with a simple signature on termination paperwork. William's final act as Sterling Tower's janitor was to clean out his small locker in the basement employee break room, gathering the few personal items he'd accumulated over more than 2 decades. A spare pair of work gloves, a coffee mug Margaret had given him on their anniversary, and a small toolkit he'd purchased with his own money to handle repairs that weren't strictly part of his job description. The locker's metal door closed with a soft click that sounded like the period at the end of a very long sentence. As he prepared to leave Sterling Tower for what he assumed would be the last time, William made one final stop at the forgotten maintenance closet where his secret had waited patiently for 5 years. The metal box felt heavier than usual as he lifted it from its hiding place, as if the truth it contained had gained weight from witnessing the injustice he had endured. He slipped it into his worn canvas bag alongside his personal effects, understanding instinctively that his moment of silence was finally ending. The elevator ride down from the basement felt like descending through the layers of his former life, each floor representing another year of invisible service that had been dismissed as easily as crumpled newspaper. When the doors opened on the lobby level, William stepped out into a space that had been his second home for decades, but now felt as foreign as a museum display case. The marble floors he'd polished thousands of times reflected his final footsteps as he walked toward the exit, carrying with him the only thing of real value he'd ever obtained from Sterling Tower, the truth that would eventually set them all free. The winter air that greeted William as he pushed through Sterling Tower's revolving doors was sharp and clean, cutting through the stale atmosphere of corruption and lies that had threatened to suffocate his spirit. Behind him, the building rose into the gray sky like a monument to injustice, its glass windows reflecting the cold February sun with the same blind brilliance that had characterized its owner's arrogance. But ahead of him stretched the streets of New York, full of possibilities and chances for redemption that money couldn't buy and power couldn't suppress. As William walked away from everything he'd known for over 2 decades, he carried with him more than just personal belongings and wounded pride. Hidden in his canvas bag was evidence that would eventually shake Sterling Tower's foundation more thoroughly than any earthquake, proof that would reveal the true criminals while restoring his own damaged reputation. But that day was still months away, waiting for the right moment when patience would finally transform into action, when silence would find its voice, and when a humble janitor would demonstrate that real power had nothing to do with net worth and everything to do with unwavering commitment to truth. The months following William's dismissal from Sterling Tower passed like a slow-motion earthquake, with tremors of consequence rippling through layers of New York's power structure that no one could see but everyone would eventually feel. William retreated to his small apartment in Queens, where Margaret's photograph watched over him as he struggled to rebuild a life that had been systematically demolished by people who confused wealth with wisdom, money with morality. His days settled into a different rhythm, marked not by the familiar routine of night shifts and cleaning schedules, but by the strange emptiness of unemployment at an age when starting over felt like climbing a mountain with broken legs. The modest savings he'd accumulated over decades evaporated quickly, consumed by legal fees, medical bills for stress-related health problems, and the simple expense of survival in a city that showed no mercy to those without steady income. But William's greatest challenge wasn't financial, it was psychological. For 23 years, his identity had been intertwined with Sterling Tower's daily operations. He'd known every elevator's quirks, every bathroom's plumbing problems, every office's climate control needs. His absence from the building created a vacuum that no one seemed prepared to fill adequately, though news of mounting maintenance problems reached him through the cleaning industry's informal network of gossip and shared experience. The replacement janitors Clark had hired went through a rotation that would have been comical if William hadn't understood the human cost of incompetence. Some lasted only weeks before quitting in frustration, overwhelmed by systems they didn't understand and responsibilities they couldn't fulfill. Others were fired when minor problems escalated into expensive disasters, their lack of institutional knowledge proving costlier than even Clark's penny-pinching mentality could tolerate. Meanwhile, William began his own quiet investigation, using the internet access at the Queens Public Library to research the people who had destroyed his life with such casual cruelty. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic corruption that made his own suffering seem like a small thread in a much larger tapestry of injustice. Clark Sterling's business empire, built supposedly on legitimate real estate investments and stock market success, showed patterns of behavior that suggested something far more sinister than simple aggressive capitalism. The metal box that had waited patiently in his apartment, hidden beneath financial documents and medical records, contained the first pieces of a puzzle that William now began assembling with the methodical precision he'd once applied to floor maintenance. Recordings made accidentally during building maintenance revealed conversations about money laundering through cryptocurrency exchanges, art theft disguised as insurance fraud, and bribery schemes that reached into city government offices responsible for building safety inspections. But the breakthrough moment came when William connected with Maria Santos, a former Sterling Tower employee who had been quietly dismissed 3 years earlier after asking too many questions about discrepancies in the building's financial records. Maria's termination had been explained as budget restructuring, but her severance package had included a non-disclosure agreement that suggested Clark's nervousness about what she might reveal to investigators or journalists. Their meeting, arranged through mutual acquaintances in the city's service worker community, took place in a small diner in Jackson Heights, where the smell of coffee and the murmur of Spanish conversations provided cover for secrets that could topple governments. Maria, a middle-aged accountant whose sharp eyes missed nothing, had been Sterling Tower's bookkeeper until her curiosity about irregular financial transactions made her a liability rather than an asset. "I knew something was wrong when the numbers stopped making sense," Maria explained, stirring sugar into coffee that had grown cold during their conversation. Invoices for artwork that was never delivered, insurance claims for thefts that never happened, consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist. Every month, millions of dollars moved through accounts I couldn't trace, always justified by explanations that sounded reasonable until you looked closer. Her revelation struck William like lightning illuminating a landscape he'd been stumbling through in darkness. The missing artifacts that had triggered his downfall weren't stolen. They were part of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme designed to generate quick cash for an empire facing mounting financial pressure. Clark's accusation against William hadn't been born from evidence, but from desperation, a calculated decision to focus attention on a convenient scapegoat while the real criminals covered their tracks. But Maria's most explosive revelation concerned the recordings William had discovered years earlier in the building's basement. She recognized dates and names mentioned in the transcripts, connecting them to specific financial transactions that proved the conversations weren't just evidence of planning, but documentation of actual crimes. Money had changed hands, artifacts had been deliberately moved to facilitate false insurance claims, and government officials had been bribed to overlook building code violations that would have exposed illegal storage areas used for smuggling operations. "He's not just stealing from insurance companies," Maria explained, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried across their small table. "Clark's running a whole network of businesses that exist only on paper, processing dirty money from sources you don't want to know about. The Sterling Tower isn't just his headquarters, it's his laundering machine, disguised as legitimate real estate investment." The weight of this knowledge settled on William's shoulders like a familiar burden, but now it carried hope alongside responsibility. His months of humiliation hadn't been just personal persecution. They'd been collateral damage in a criminal enterprise that had operated successfully for years by exploiting exactly the kind of invisibility that had defined his own working life. The janitor who was ignored, the bookkeeper who was silenced, the security guards who were rotated frequently to prevent them from observing patterns, all were victims of a system designed to hide truth behind walls of wealth and privilege. As spring arrived in New York, bringing with it the promise of renewal and rebirth, William began preparing for the most important work of his life. The evidence he'd protected for years, combined with Maria's financial documentation and the contacts she'd maintained throughout the cleaning and service industry, formed the foundation for a case that could bring down not just Clark Sterling, but the entire network of corruption he'd created. But William understood that evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient against opponents with unlimited legal resources and political connections. He needed allies who couldn't be bought, journalists whose integrity exceeded their fear of lawsuits, and law enforcement officials whose commitment to justice surpassed their career ambitions. Most importantly, he needed perfect timing, the kind of coordination that would prevent Clark from destroying evidence or fleeing to countries without extradition treaties. The break he'd been waiting for came from an unexpected source: Anthony Morrison, a young investigative journalist for the New York Tribune whose recent expose of city council corruption had earned both national recognition and death threats from people who preferred their criminal activities to remain hidden. Morrison had been following leads about irregular building permits and safety inspections in Manhattan's luxury real estate market when sources began mentioning Sterling Tower's unusual exemptions from normal regulatory oversight. Their initial contact was cautious, conducted through intermediaries who could provide deniability if the investigation went wrong. But when Morrison reviewed the evidence William had assembled, his excitement was palpable, even through encrypted email communications. This wasn't just a story about insurance fraud or money laundering. It was a glimpse into how New York's economic elite operated above the law, protected by wealth that could buy immunity from consequences that destroyed regular citizens. This could bring down half the city's power structure, Morrison explained during their first face-to-face meeting, held in Central Park where surveillance would be difficult and witnesses would be abundant. Sterling's just the visible tip of an iceberg that goes much deeper than anyone imagines. But we need to be smart about this. One mistake, and they'll bury us both so deep we'll never see daylight again. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in patience and precision, qualities William had learned during decades of invisible labor, but which now served a higher purpose than floor maintenance and trash collection. Morrison's journalistic skills combined with Maria's financial expertise and William's intimate knowledge of Sterling Tower's operations created a formidable team united by shared commitment to truth and justice. They worked methodically, building their case piece by piece, while Clark Sterling remained unaware that his former janitor was constructing the framework for his destruction. Phone calls were recorded, financial documents were analyzed, and patterns of behavior were documented with the same meticulous attention to detail William had once applied to keeping Sterling Tower's operations running smoothly. As summer approached and their investigation neared completion, William felt a familiar sensation, the quiet anticipation that preceded major change, like the atmospheric pressure drop before thunderstorms. Somewhere in Sterling Tower's gleaming heights, Clark Sterling was conducting business as usual, confident that his wealth provided immunity from consequences. He had no idea that the man he'd destroyed so casually was about to return that favor with compound interest, wielding truth as a weapon more powerful than any amount of money or political influence. The wheels of justice, William had learned, often turned slowly but with inexorable force once properly set in motion. Soon, very soon, Sterling Tower would experience its own earthquake, not from shifting earth beneath its foundation, but from shifting power relationships that would demonstrate once and for all that real strength had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with unwavering commitment to what was right. The late summer heat that settled over Manhattan like a suffocating blanket seemed to mirror the pressure building within Sterling Tower's gleaming walls, though Clark Sterling remained blissfully unaware that his empire was developing structural cracks that no amount of money could repair. From his penthouse office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of a city he believed he owned through influence and investment, Clark continued orchestrating his various criminal enterprises with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. But 67 floors below, in the mechanical spaces and service corridors William had once maintained with such careful attention, systems were beginning to fail. In ways that seemed almost orchestrated by fate itself. The new janitorial staff, rotating through positions with the frequency of seasonal workers, lacked the institutional knowledge necessary to prevent small problems from cascading into expensive disasters. Water pipes leaked because no one understood the building's quirky plumbing system, elevators malfunctioned because maintenance schedules had been ignored, and the climate control system struggled to function without the subtle adjustments William had made instinctively after decades of experience. Each failure cost Sterling Tower thousands of dollars in emergency repairs, overtime labor charges, and tenant complaints that threatened lease renewals worth millions in annual revenue. But the financial bleeding was nothing compared to the deeper hemorrhaging that Clark couldn't see. The gradual erosion of confidence among investors, tenants, and business partners who had begun noticing that the building's legendary efficiency had disappeared along with its longtime janitor. The first serious crack in Clark's facade appeared during a meeting with international investors interested in purchasing shares of Sterling Tower's parent company. These were sophisticated financiers from London and Tokyo, accustomed to evaluating commercial properties worth hundreds of millions, whose due diligence investigations could detect systemic problems that less experienced investors might miss. During their tour of the building, multiple elevator breakdowns, malfunctioning air conditioning, and visible maintenance issues created exactly the kind of negative impression that could derail negotiations worth more than Clark's annual revenue stream. "Your building seems to be experiencing operational difficulties," observed Patricia Chen, a real estate investment specialist from Hong Kong whose portfolio included properties across 3 continents. Her polite diplomatic language couldn't disguise the concern evident in her voice as she documented problems that suggested deeper management issues than simple maintenance oversights. Clark's response revealed the psychological pressure he'd been suppressing for months. Instead of addressing the investor's legitimate concerns professionally, he launched into a rambling explanation about disloyal employees and sabotage by terminated workers that made him sound paranoid and defensive. His accusations against William, delivered to people who had never heard the janitor's name before, painted a picture of an executive losing control rather than a leader managing temporary setbacks. The international investors departed that afternoon without making any commitments, their interest in Sterling Tower effectively dead on arrival. Word of their negative assessment spread quickly through New York's real estate investment community, where reputation determined access to capital and credibility affected property valuations more directly than market conditions. Within weeks, Clark found himself struggling to maintain financing arrangements that had once been automatic, as banks and private investors began questioning the stability of an empire that had seemed unshakable just months earlier. But Clark's financial difficulties were merely symptoms of a deeper disease that was slowly consuming his organization from within. The criminal enterprises that had generated much of his wealth operated on networks of trust and mutual protection that required constant maintenance and careful coordination. As his attention became divided between legitimate business problems and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain cash flow, cracks began appearing in systems designed to hide illegal activities from law enforcement and regulatory oversight. The first major breach occurred when a cryptocurrency exchange used for money laundering was hacked by unknown actors who released transaction records showing suspicious patterns of international money transfers. While the hacker's identity remained unknown, the timing seemed almost providential, occurring just as Anthony Morrison was preparing to publish his investigative series about corruption in New York's luxury real estate market. Morrison's articles, when they finally appeared in the Tribune, struck Sterling Tower like a perfectly aimed missile, each revelation calculated for maximum impact and supported by documentation that would be difficult to challenge in court. The first article focused on building permit irregularities and safety inspection exemptions that had allowed Clark to modify Sterling Tower's structure without proper oversight. The second exposed financial relationships between Clark and city officials, whose decisions benefited his business interests in ways that bordered on bribery. The third revealed patterns of insurance fraud involving fake art thefts and inflated claims designed to generate quick cash for declining business operations. But it was the fourth article that delivered the killing blow, featuring tape recordings of Clark discussing money laundering operations with criminal associates whose names appeared on FBI watch lists and international law enforcement databases. The recordings, played in their entirety on the Tribune's website, captured Clark's voice, clearly discussing cryptocurrency transactions, offshore banking arrangements, and bribery schemes with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch rather than coordinating felonies that carried decades of prison time. The source of these recordings remained mysteriously unidentified in Morrison's articles, described only as a long-time building employee with intimate knowledge of Sterling Towers operations. But anyone familiar with the building's history could deduce that only someone with decades of access and careful observation could have assembled such comprehensive documentation of criminal activity spanning multiple years and involving dozens of transactions. The media firestorm that followed Morrison's revelations made Sterling Towers' previous problems seem trivial by comparison. Television news crews gathered outside the building like besieging armies, their cameras capturing images of confusion and chaos as government investigators arrived with search warrants, asset forfeiture orders, and arrest warrants that turned Clark's penthouse office into a crime scene rather than a center of power. The FBI's investigation, when it finally became public, revealed the true scope of Clark's criminal enterprise in ways that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials accustomed to white-collar crime. Sterling Tower hadn't just been Clark's headquarters. It had been the operational center for a network involving money laundering, international smuggling, bribery, insurance fraud, and tax evasion that had operated successfully for over a decade by exploiting exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had allowed Williams' persecution to proceed without serious scrutiny. Clark's arrest, when it finally occurred, lacked the dramatic confrontation one might expect from television crime dramas. Instead, it happened quietly in his penthouse office on a Tuesday morning when federal agents presented him with an indictment containing 47 separate charges that could potentially result in consecutive prison sentences totaling more than 2 centuries. The man who had fired Williams so casually 9 months earlier now faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. His vast fortune frozen, pending asset forfeiture proceedings that would eventually distribute his wealth to victims of his crimes. The collapse of Sterling Towers' management structure created chaos throughout New York's real estate and financial communities, but it also created opportunities for justice that had seemed impossible just months earlier. As prosecutors began building cases against Clark's extensive network of criminal associates, they discovered evidence of systematic corruption involving dozens of city officials, business leaders, and financial institutions whose illegal activities had been enabled by the same arrogance and sense of immunity that had destroyed Williams' life so carelessly. But perhaps the most satisfying revelation came when investigators examining Sterling Towers' employment records discovered patterns of discrimination and retaliation against workers who had asked inconvenient questions or observed suspicious activities. Maria Santos, the former bookkeeper whose financial documentation had provided crucial evidence for Morrison's investigation, was contacted by federal prosecutors interested in her testimony about accounting irregularities that stretched back years before her termination. Her wrongful dismissal lawsuit against Sterling Tower, previously dismissed as nuisance litigation, suddenly became a federal civil rights case with the potential for millions in damages and precedent-setting legal reforms. As autumn returned to New York, bringing with it the anniversary of Williams' false accusation and unjust dismissal, Sterling Tower stood empty except for federal investigators cataloging evidence and accountants attempting to untangle financial records that revealed the true extent of Clark's criminal operations. The building that had once represented the pinnacle of New York's commercial real estate market had become a symbol of justice finally served, its marble floors and crystal chandeliers bearing witness to the downfall of someone who had confused wealth with wisdom, money with morality. Somewhere in Queens, in a modest apartment where Margaret's photograph still watched over everything with quiet dignity, William Harris read newspaper accounts of Clark Sterling's legal troubles with the same careful attention he had once applied to maintenance schedules and security reports. His vindication wouldn't restore the months of suffering he'd endured or repair the damage inflicted on his reputation and health, but it proved something more valuable than money could buy, that truth, given enough time and support, could overcome even the most sophisticated systems of corruption and deception. The phone call came on a crisp October morning exactly 1 year after William had been accused of theft and subjected to 3 months of investigation that had nearly destroyed his life. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Sullivan, no relation to his late wife, but rather the newly appointed federal trustee overseeing Sterling Tower's operations while prosecutors prepared their case against Clark Sterling's criminal enterprise. "Mr. Harris," Margaret Sullivan's voice carried the professional warmth of someone accustomed to delivering both good and bad news with equal dignity. "I've been reviewing employment records and witness statements related to our investigation of the Sterling Tower case. I believe we need to have a conversation about correcting some significant injustices that occurred during Mr. Sterling's management of the property." The meeting took place not in Sterling Tower's intimidating conference rooms where William had once been interrogated like a criminal, but in a modest federal office building in Lower Manhattan where justice was administered without marble floors or crystal chandeliers. Margaret Sullivan, a career federal prosecutor whose gray hair and lined face spoke of decades spent fighting corruption in various forms, greeted William with the respect he had been denied for months by people who confused wealth with worth. "Before we discuss anything else," Sullivan began, pulling a thick file from her desk drawer, "I want to apologize on behalf of the federal government for what you endured. Our investigation has revealed that your persecution was not just unjust, it was a deliberate criminal act designed to cover up fraud and direct attention away from the real perpetrators." The documents she spread across the conference table told a story that was both vindicating and heartbreaking. FBI analysis of Sterling Tower's security footage had revealed digital manipulation that had created false gaps during the time when artifacts supposedly went missing. Financial records showed that the missing items had never actually been stolen. Instead, they had been moved to secure storage facilities as part of insurance fraud schemes designed to generate quick cash for Clark's increasingly desperate financial situation. Most damning of all were recorded conversations between Clark and his criminal associates discussing the selection of William as their scapegoat, conversations that revealed the calculation behind his persecution with chilling clarity. "The janitor's perfect," Clark's voice came through FBI surveillance recordings with crystal clarity. "He's poor, he's invisible, he has access to everything, and nobody will believe his word against ours. We destroy his life, collect the insurance money, and move on to the next operation." The casual cruelty evident in those recordings hit William harder than he had expected, even though he had suspected the truth for months. Hearing his persecution described in such transactional terms, as if his suffering was simply a business expense in Clark's criminal enterprise, forced him to confront the reality that his decades of loyal service had meant absolutely nothing to the people he had served so faithfully. But Margaret Sullivan's next revelation provided emotional compensation that no amount of money could have purchased. The investigation had uncovered evidence that William's careful maintenance work had actually prevented several serious accidents and building code violations that could have resulted in deaths or injuries to Sterling Tower's occupants. His invisible labor had literally saved lives over the years, though Clark Sterling had never bothered to acknowledge or appreciate his contributions. "Your employment record," Sullivan explained, pulling out performance evaluations that William had never seen, "shows consistent excellence and reliability that Clark Sterling's management chose to ignore when they needed a scapegoat. You weren't just innocent of the charges against you. You were probably the most honest and dedicated employee in the entire building." The federal trustee's offer, when it finally came, was more generous than William had dared to hope during his darkest months of unemployment and humiliation. Full reinstatement with back pay, compensation for legal fees and medical expenses related to his wrongful dismissal, and a formal apology that would be made public as part of the government's commitment to correcting the injustices committed during Clark's criminal administration of Sterling Tower. But the details that mattered most to William weren't financial. His personnel file would be corrected to show that he had been wrongfully accused and completely exonerated, with commendations for his years of dedicated service and recognition of his role in exposing criminal activities. His reputation, damaged by months of false accusations and media coverage that had portrayed him as a desperate thief, would be officially restored with the full backing of federal law enforcement. "There's one more thing," Sullivan added as their meeting neared its conclusion. "We'd like to offer you a position as our liaison for the Sterling Tower restoration project. Your knowledge of the building's operations and your demonstrated integrity would be invaluable as we work to return the property to legitimate business use." The irony wasn't lost on William that the same institutional knowledge Clark had dismissed as unimportant was now being recognized as essential for Sterling Tower's future operations. The building's new management would need someone who understood its quirks, its systems, and its history, someone who had maintained its operations through years of criminal mismanagement while preserving evidence that eventually brought the criminals to justice. Walking back to the subway station after his meeting with Margaret Sullivan, William felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of false accusation and damaged reputation was finally lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the satisfaction of justice served and dignity restored. Sterling Tower loomed above him as he passed on his way to the train, its familiar profile no longer a source of pain, but a symbol of his own resilience and ultimate vindication. The news of William's exoneration and reinstatement made headlines in the same newspapers that had once portrayed him as a criminal, though the coverage this time focused more on the systematic corruption his persecution had helped expose than on his personal vindication. Anthony Morrison's follow-up articles in the Tribune painted William as an unlikely hero, whose patience and integrity had brought down a criminal empire that might otherwise have operated indefinitely. But the most meaningful recognition came not from media coverage or official government statements, but from the community of service workers throughout New York who saw William's story as validation of their own dignity and worth. Janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, and building superintendents understood intuitively that his persecution could have happened to any of them, and his vindication proved that invisible labor deserved respect and protection under the law. Messages of support arrived daily at William's Queens apartment, handwritten letters from building porters who had followed his story, email messages from security guards who respected his courage, and phone calls from maintenance workers who understood that his victory was their victory too. These were people who knew that hidden knowledge and quiet observation were often more powerful than wealth and influence, people who understood that real strength came from integrity rather than bank accounts. As winter approached and Sterling Tower prepared to reopen under new management, William began planning his return to the building where he had spent more than 2 decades maintaining order, preserving evidence, and ultimately helping to expose the truth that set them all free. This time, however, he would return not as an invisible janitor whose contributions went unrecognized, but as a federal liaison whose expertise was officially valued and whose integrity was beyond question. The circle was closing, but instead of ending where it began, William's story was entering a new chapter where justice had triumphed over arrogance, where truth had proven more powerful than wealth, and where a humble man's patience had ultimately brought down an empire built on lies. Sterling Tower would soon echo once again with the sound of his footsteps, but now they would walk in dignity rather than invisibility, carrying the respect he had always deserved but finally received. On a cold December morning that sparkled with the kind of clarity that only comes after storms have passed, William Harris stood once again in the lobby of Sterling Tower. But this time everything was different. The same Italian marble floors stretched before him, polished to mirror perfection by successors who had tried but failed to match his meticulous standards. The same crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across surfaces he had maintained for over 2 decades, their light now illuminating a scene of reunion rather than persecution. But William himself was transformed in ways that went far deeper than his new federal liaison credentials or the respect now evident in every interaction. The months of suffering had aged him, certainly, but they had also refined his character like precious metal tested in fire, revealing strengths he hadn't known he possessed and wisdom earned through enduring injustice with dignity intact. Margaret Sullivan stood beside him in the lobby, her federal authority commanding immediate attention from the building's temporary management staff. "Gentlemen," she announced to the assembled group of security guards, maintenance workers, and administrative personnel, "I'd like you to meet William Harris, who will be serving as our primary liaison for Sterling Towers' operational restoration. Mr. Harris has more institutional knowledge about this building than anyone else alive, and his integrity has been instrumental in our successful prosecution of the criminal enterprise that previously controlled these operations." The silence that followed carried weight beyond mere professional courtesy. These were people who had heard William's story, who understood that his presence represented not just a return to work, but a victory for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or persecuted by those who confused wealth with wisdom. Several of the security guards, themselves working-class New Yorkers who recognized institutional injustice when they saw it, nodded with quiet respect. That meant more to William than any formal ceremony could have provided. His first task was both symbolic and practical, conducting a comprehensive assessment of Sterling Towers' current condition and developing plans for restoring the operational excellence that had characterized the building before Clark Sterling's criminal management had allowed systems to deteriorate through neglect and incompetence. Walking through corridors he knew better than his own apartment, William cataloged problems that ranged from minor maintenance oversights to serious safety violations that could have resulted in catastrophic failures. The elevator in the building's northeast corner, which had been experiencing intermittent malfunctions for months, needed replacement of control circuits that William had been requesting for 3 years before his dismissal. The climate control system serving the upper floors was struggling because air filters hadn't been changed according to the schedule he had developed through decades of experience with the building's unique requirements. Even the security cameras showed evidence of tampering, not by criminals, but by incompetent technicians who had disrupted systems that had funcionado perfectly under his careful maintenance. But as William moved through Sterling Towers' familiar spaces, he also discovered evidence of the chaos that had followed his departure. Emergency repair bills totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars for problems he could have prevented with routine maintenance, tenant complaints about service disruptions that had cost the building several major leases worth millions in annual revenue, insurance claims for water damage and electrical failures that never would have occurred if his preventive maintenance schedules had been followed consistently. The irony was both bitter and satisfying. Clark Sterling's decision to destroy William's life had ultimately contributed to his own downfall, as the building's declining operational performance had raised questions among investors and regulators that eventually led to the investigation exposing his criminal activities. The janitor, whose work had been invisible and unappreciated, had proven essential in ways that became obvious only through his absence. William's restoration work proceeded with the methodical precision that had characterized his original employment, but now his expertise was recognized and respected rather than ignored and taken for granted. Federal supervisors sought his advice on everything from security protocols to maintenance schedules, understanding that his institutional knowledge was irreplaceable, and his judgment had been validated by circumstances that left no room for doubt about his integrity. The building's transformation under William's guidance occurred gradually but unmistakably, like watching a garden recover from neglect under the care of someone who understood its particular needs and quirks. Elevators ran smoothly, climate systems maintained perfect comfort levels, and security operations functioned with efficiency that hadn't been seen since before Clark Sterling's criminal management had prioritized profit over performance. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than operational. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had characterized Sterling Tower under Clark's authoritarian leadership was replaced by mutual respect and professional cooperation that reflected William's own approach to human relationships. His example, quiet dignity maintained through extreme adversity, integrity preserved despite powerful incentives for compromise, justice pursued through patience rather than revenge, inspired others throughout the building to embrace higher standards in their own work and interactions. New tenants moving into Sterling Tower after its reopening under federal oversight often commented on the building's exceptional atmosphere, noting that everyone from security guards to maintenance workers seemed genuinely committed to excellence rather than simply completing minimum requirements. What they were observing was the influence of someone whose character had been tested under the most difficult circumstances and proven unshakable in its commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. The federal investigation's conclusion brought final vindication for William and ultimate justice for Clark Sterling, whose criminal trial had become front-page news throughout New York's media landscape. The evidence William had preserved for years, combined with testimony from witnesses like Maria Santos and documentation provided by investigative journalists like Anthony Morrison, resulted in convictions on multiple felony charges that would keep Clark in federal prison for the rest of his natural life. But the trial's most powerful moment came when William was called to testify about his treatment during Clark's management of Sterling Tower. Standing in the federal courthouse witness box, wearing a simple gray suit that Margaret had purchased for his appearances, William spoke with quiet dignity about his decades of service, his wrongful persecution, and his commitment to truth even when it seemed that justice would never prevail. "Your Honor," William said during his final minutes of testimony, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I never wanted revenge against Mr. Sterling or anyone else. I just wanted the truth to be known. And I wanted people to understand that honest work deserves respect, regardless of how much money someone earns or what kind of suit they wear." The courtroom silence following William's testimony was profound, broken only by the sound of pencils scribbling notes and cameras clicking as reporters documented words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. Here was a man who had endured months of humiliation and hardship without becoming bitter, who had pursued justice without seeking vengeance, who had demonstrated that real strength came from character rather than bank accounts. Clark Sterling's sentencing hearing, held on a spring morning exactly 2 years after William's wrongful dismissal, brought final closure to a saga that had captivated New York's attention and inspired service workers throughout the country. The judge's words, as he imposed consecutive sentences totaling 45 years in federal prison, explicitly referenced the cruel injustice Clark had inflicted on William and other innocent employees whose lives had been damaged by his criminal enterprise. The defendant's treatment of William Harris, Judge Patricia Morrison stated, her voice carrying the moral weight of judicial authority, represents everything that is wrong with a system that allows wealth to shield criminals from consequences and poverty to expose innocents to persecution. Mr. Harris's dignity throughout this ordeal stands in stark contrast to the defendant's behavior and serves as a reminder that real honor cannot be purchased or inherited. As spring turned to summer and Sterling Tower's restoration neared completion, William began considering his own future with a sense of possibility that had been absent from his life for years. The federal liaison position had restored his financial security and professional reputation, but more importantly, it had validated his life's work in ways that gave meaning to all the years of invisible labor and unrecognized sacrifice. Messages continued arriving from service workers throughout New York and across the country who had followed his story and found inspiration in his example. Janitors, security guards, building superintendents, and maintenance workers understood that William's vindication was their vindication too, proof that invisible labor deserved recognition and protection under the law. But the recognition that meant most to William came from an unexpected source, a letter from Margaret's former colleagues at the Queens Community Center, where she had volunteered during their marriage. These were people who had known them both during their best years together, who remembered Margaret's pride in William's work and his devotion to maintaining Sterling Tower's operations with impeccable integrity. Margaret always said you were the most honest man she'd ever known, the letter concluded, and she would be so proud to see that your integrity has been vindicated in such a public way. You've shown the world that real wealth comes from character, and real strength comes from doing what's right even when it's difficult. As autumn arrived once again in New York, William found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had taken him from invisible janitor to federal witness to respected liaison whose expertise was valued and whose integrity was beyond question. Sterling Tower hummed around him with the efficient operation that had always been his professional signature, but now his contributions were visible rather than hidden, appreciated rather than taken for granted. The building's new tenants, carefully screened by federal oversight to ensure legitimate business operations, often stopped to thank William personally for his role in creating such an exceptional working environment. These were entrepreneurs, professionals, and business owners who understood that operational excellence required dedication and expertise that couldn't be purchased but had to be earned through years of patient service. "Mr. Harris," said Jennifer Chen, a technology entrepreneur whose startup had leased space on Sterling Tower's 15th floor, "I just wanted you to know that this is the best managed building I've ever worked in. The attention to detail and commitment to excellence is obvious in everything from elevator service to climate control. Thank you for making this such a professional environment." Such recognition would have been unimaginable during William's years of invisible labor under Clark Sterling's management, when his expertise was dismissed and his contributions went unacknowledged. Now, however, his knowledge was recognized as the foundation for Sterling Tower's successful transformation from criminal headquarters to legitimate business center. As December approached and William prepared to celebrate the second anniversary of his vindication, he received a phone call that would add a final chapter to his remarkable story. The voice belonged to David Kim, a documentary filmmaker whose previous work had exposed corruption in various industries, and who had been following William's story since Anthony Morrison's initial Tribune articles revealed the scope of Clark Sterling's criminal enterprise. "Mr. Harris," Kim explained during their initial conversation, "I'd like to make a documentary about your experiences and their broader implications for how our society treats working-class people. Your story isn't just about one man's vindication. It's about the dignity of labor and the power of integrity in the face of systematic injustice." The documentary project, when William finally agreed to participate, became more than just a film about his personal experiences. Kim's research revealed that William's persecution had been part of a broader pattern of scapegoating that criminal organizations used to deflect attention from their illegal activities, targeting vulnerable workers whose poverty made them easy targets for false accusations. The film's title, The Invisible Witness, captured the central irony of William's story, that his very invisibility had enabled him to observe and document criminal activities that more visible employees might never have accessing. His decades of quiet observation had made him the perfect witness to expose corruption that had operated successfully by exploiting exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had enabled his own persecution. When The Invisible Witness premiered at the New York Film Festival, William found himself in the unusual position of being celebrated rather than ignored, applauded rather than humiliated. The audience's response to his story, a sustained ovation that lasted several minutes, represented recognition not just for his individual courage, but for the dignity of invisible labor performed by millions of people whose contributions were essential but unacknowledged. The documentary's success brought William opportunities he had never imagined: invitations to speak at conferences about workplace justice, consulting opportunities with organizations seeking to improve their treatment of service workers, and interview requests from journalists interested in his perspectives on dignity, integrity, and the value of patient determination in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the service worker community itself. The National Association of Building Service Workers created an annual award in Williams' honor, recognizing individuals who demonstrated exceptional integrity while facing workplace adversity. The William Harris Award became a symbol of quiet heroism that inspired custodians, security guards, and maintenance workers throughout the country to take pride in their essential contributions to society's functioning. As winter settled over New York and Sterling Tower prepared for another year of operation under Williams' careful oversight, he often found himself standing in the lobby after hours, remembering the decades of invisible labor that had led to this moment of recognition and respect. The marble floors still gleamed under crystal chandeliers, but now they reflected the dignity of someone whose worth had been validated by truth rather than wealth, whose character had been tested by adversity and found unbreakable. Margaret's photograph, displayed prominently in his federal office rather than hidden in his apartment, watched over everything with the same gentle smile that had sustained him through the darkest months of his persecution. Her memory served as a constant reminder that real wealth couldn't be measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios, but existed in relationships built on trust, work, performed with integrity, and love that transcended material circumstances. The metal box that had once contained evidence of criminal activities now held letters from service workers across the country who had found inspiration in Williams' example, newspaper clippings documenting his vindication, and copies of federal documents officially acknowledging his crucial role in exposing and prosecuting criminal activities that could have continued indefinitely without his patient documentation and courageous testimony. Sterling Tower's transformation had become more than just a restoration project. It had evolved into a symbol of justice served and dignity restored, proof that truth could overcome deception and integrity could triumph over corruption given enough time and determination. The building that had once represented the pinnacle of arrogant wealth now stood as a monument to the power of humble service and patient virtue. On quiet winter evenings, when Sterling Tower's offices were empty and its corridors echoed only with the soft hum of perfectly maintained mechanical systems, William would walk through spaces he knew better than anyone alive, checking details that ensured continued operational excellence while reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from invisible janitor to respected professional whose expertise was valued and whose integrity was beyond question. His footsteps no longer moved with the careful invisibility of someone trying to avoid notice, but with the confident stride of someone whose worth had been proven beyond doubt and whose place in the world was secure. The same hands that had once gripped a broom handle now carried keys to executive offices and federal authority that could influence operations affecting thousands of lives. But perhaps most importantly, William's story had inspired countless other invisible workers to understand that their labor possessed dignity regardless of recognition, that their integrity had value beyond monetary compensation, and that patience combined with truth could indeed move mountains, even mountains of marble, steel, and accumulated wealth that seemed impregnable to those who had never learned to observe carefully and wait for the right moment to act. As spring returned to New York for the third time since William's vindication, bringing with it renewal and the promise of continued growth, Sterling Tower stood as a testament to the power of truth over deception, integrity over corruption, and patience over revenge. The building's operational excellence, restored under William's expert guidance, served as daily proof that invisible labor deserved recognition, that honest work merited respect, and that dignity couldn't be destroyed by those who confused money with morality. The years that followed would bring continued recognition for William's exemplary character and professional expertise, but the foundation for everything had been established during those dark months when he chose truth over bitterness, patience over revenge, and integrity over the easy path of surrender. His vindication hadn't just restored one man's reputation, it had reminded an entire city that real strength came from character rather than bank accounts, that genuine power resided in moral courage rather than financial influence. And you? Have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you been blamed for problems you didn't create, dismissed by people who never bothered to understand your worth, or treated as if your years of dedicated service meant nothing when convenient scapegoats were needed? William Harris's story reminds us that dignity can survive the worst persecution, that truth has its own timeline, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can arrive with power that money cannot buy. Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moments when you've been overlooked, underestimated, or treated unfairly by those who should have known better. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of your own worth, leave a like and subscribe so it can reach others who need to hear that their invisible labor matters, their integrity has value, and their patience may yet be rewarded with recognition they deserve. For more stories of quiet heroes whose dignity shines brighter than wealth, whose integrity proves stronger than corruption, and whose patience ultimately triumphs over injustice, click the podcast link to the left. These are stories for everyone who has swept floors, monitored security cameras, maintained equipment, or locked buildings at night while dreaming of respect that seemed forever beyond reach. Thank you for walking this journey with us, for believing that character matters more than bank accounts, and for understanding that real heroes often wear work uniforms rather than expensive suits. We'll see you in the next story, where once again we'll discover that the most powerful people in the world are often those whose strength goes unnoticed until the moment when truth finally finds its voice and justice claims its rightful place. William Harris never wore the finest suit in Sterling Tower, but he kept his word when it mattered most. In the end, that made all the difference.